A desperate race against time. Dr. Daniel Martin walked briskly through the corridors of Mercy General Hospital, his thoughts already on the patient waiting for him in the emergency room. His navy blue scrubs clung to his frame as the faint scent of antiseptic filled the air. It was a typical morning. People hustling through the hallways, the soft hum of machines in the background, and the faint buzz of fluorescent lights overhead. But something about today felt different. A code blue had been called. That meant a critical emergency was in progress, and it was his turn to save a life. As he pushed through the double doors leading into the ER, the scene before him was already chaotic. Nurses moved with practiced efficiency, monitoring the flow of information, while trauma surgeons were already on the scene, preparing for what was to come. But even amidst the flurry of activity, Dr. Martin's eyes immediately locked onto the patient. A young boy, no older than 10, laying motionless on the gurney. Elijah Parker, a name that would soon mean more to him than any other. The boy's tiny body was battered and bruised, the marks of a violent car crash, evident all over his fragile frame. His face was a mask of deep pain, the blood still fresh in the gashes that ran across his skin. His chest heaved unevenly, shallow breaths that struggled to draw in the much-needed air. His pulse, if detectable at all, was barely there. His veins collapsed under the pressure, struggling to pump the life he had left into his limp body. His parents stood nearby, their faces filled with helpless fear, clinging to the hope that their son would pull through. The car accident had left Elijah with severe internal bleeding, broken bones, and a punctured lung. Dr. Martin could tell by the look in his eyes that the boy was on the brink of death. The question wasn't whether he would live or die. It was whether Dr. Martin could make the difference before it was too late. "Doctor, his vitals are dropping," one of the nurses shouted as she scanned the boy's ECG monitor. "Get the blood transfusion ready," Dr. Martin ordered, already stepping into action. "I'm not losing him." His hands moved with practiced precision as he assessed Elijah's condition. The boy's skin was cold to the touch, and his limbs stiff from the trauma. But his heart, still beating, though weak, gave Dr. Martin a small flicker of hope. They could save him. They had to. "What happened?" Dr. Martin asked, turning to the parents who were visibly distraught. Elijah's father, a middle-aged man with dark hair peppered with gray, took a shaking breath as he spoke. "We were on our way home from my brother's house. Another car ran the red light. We never saw it coming." His voice cracked with emotion, but he managed to continue. "The driver, he hit us head-on. My wife, she's badly injured too. But Elijah was in the back seat. He took the brunt of the impact." Dr. Martin nodded, his mind already shifting into overdrive. "I need you both to stay back for now. We'll do everything we can to stabilize him. I need you to trust us." The parents nodded, eyes full of worry, but their faith in the doctor was clear. "All right, let's get him into surgery." "Now," Dr. Martin instructed, the urgency in his tone undeniable. As the medical team worked to stabilize Elijah, Dr. Martin quickly calculated the risks: internal bleeding, a collapsed lung, and multiple fractures. There was no room for error. This was a race against time, one he had won many times before. But the sense of dread gnawing at his stomach told him that this time he wasn't sure what the outcome would be. The ore was prepped, the sterile tools gleaming under the bright lights, and the team readied themselves. Dr. Martin donned his gloves, his mind running through the procedures in his head. Everything needed to be perfect. Elijah was wheeled into the operating room, and the door shut with a soft click behind him. Inside, the only sounds were the sterile beeps of the machines and the rhythmic hum of the air conditioning. Dr. Martin quickly took charge. "Start the blood transfusion," he ordered. "Get the chest tube in place. We need to relieve the pressure on his lungs immediately." Elijah's pulse was erratic, his blood pressure dangerously low, but Dr. Martin's hands were steady. As he worked on Elijah's chest, repairing the punctured lung and controlling the bleeding. He could feel the weight of his responsibility bearing down on him. But there was something else, something deeper stirring in him. Elijah's face, pale and vulnerable, reminded him of his own son, Ethan, only a few years younger than the boy on the table. What if it was Ethan lying here, struggling for his life? Dr. Martin shook off the thought, focusing solely on his patient. Every breath Elijah took, every move of the scalpel, mattered. The procedure dragged on for what felt like an eternity. Dr. Martin worked tirelessly, his concentration unwavering. There was no space for doubt, no room for hesitation. The boy's life depended on him, and he couldn't afford to fail. Hours passed, but when the last stitch was placed and Elijah's vitals finally stabilized, Dr. Martin allowed himself a moment of relief. The boy was alive. For now. As the surgical team wrapped up, Dr. Martin stood over Elijah's bed, his heart still racing. His hands were drenched in blood, his face streaked with sweat. He wiped his brow and looked down at the boy, fragile, barely hanging on, but still breathing. He wasn't sure if Elijah would make it through the night, but he had given him a fighting chance. Elijah's parents were waiting outside the operating room. When they saw Dr. Martin approach, their eyes were filled with a mixture of hope and fear. The look on the doctor's face was unreadable, but his actions spoke volumes. "How is he, doctor?" Elijah's father asked, voice trembling. "He's alive," Dr. Martin said quietly. "It was a tough surgery, but we've done everything we can. He's in critical condition, but he has a chance." Tanya, Elijah's mother, sobbed with relief, collapsing into her husband's arms. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with gratitude. "Thank you so much." Dr. Martin nodded, his chest tight with the overwhelming emotions he refused to let show. He had done his job. He had saved Elijah's life. But there was something about this particular case that gnawed at him, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. He turned to leave, but just before he reached the door, he looked back one last time at Elijah, still unconscious, but holding on to life by the slimmest of margins. That night, Dr. Martin didn't sleep. He stayed awake, running through the events of the day in his mind. He thought about Elijah, about his own family, and the constant balance between work and home life. He thought about the toll his job had taken on his relationships, his children, and his sense of self. And then, in the quiet hours of the night, he thought about Elijah's parents, how grateful they had been, how much they had trusted him. But above all, he thought about the future. Elijah would survive this, he was certain of that. But how would the boy repay him for the chance at life? That question lingered in his mind, as uncertain and heavy as the fate of every patient who passed through Mercy General's doors. The only thing Dr. Martin knew for sure was this: he would never forget Elijah, and the debt the boy had offered, though, in his mind, it was a debt that could never be repaid. The unexpected gift. Days passed, and the sterile white walls of the hospital room became a familiar sight for Elijah and his family. Dr. Martin visited regularly, his presence a quiet reassurance in the midst of their fear. Elijah had been moved from the intensive care unit to a recovery room, and while his condition was stable, his journey was far from over. He had endured multiple surgeries, and although the road ahead was uncertain, there was a glimmer of hope. His pulse had strengthened, and his oxygen levels had improved, but there were still concerns about his recovery. Elijah's parents, Tanya and Michael, were in a state of exhausted relief. The exhaustion came from the sleepless nights, the worry, and the endless flood of emotions, but the relief was evident in their every move, every breath they took. Their son had survived. Dr. Martin had given them a chance to have their child back. It was late one afternoon when Dr. Martin entered Elijah's room, the familiar smell of antiseptic and faint traces of medication filling the air. Elijah was sitting up in bed, his pale skin now tinted with a hint of life, his eyes brighter than before. He still had tubes attached to him, and his breathing was labored, but there was something new about his expression. a spark of hope. "Hello, Elijah," Dr. Martin greeted warmly, though his tone was cautious, still wary of the young boy's fragility. Elijah's face lit up when he saw Dr. Martin enter. The boy's smile, though faint, was a moment of triumph in a world that had been colored by fear and uncertainty. "Dr. Martin," Elijah said, his voice weak but filled with genuine joy. "You came back." Dr. Martin smiled softly, trying to push past the weariness of the past few days. "Of course I did. I told you I'd be checking on you regularly. How are you feeling?" Elijah winced slightly as he shifted in bed, adjusting the bandages that covered parts of his body. "I'm better. Not great, but better." Tanya, Elijah's mother, stood from her chair by the window and approached, a mixture of gratitude and exhaustion on her face. "He's stronger today. We're hoping this is a good sign." Dr. Martin nodded, checking the monitors that tracked Elijah's heart rate and oxygen levels. They were steady, better than the day before, and that was something to celebrate. "I'm glad to see you improving, Elijah," Dr. Martin said, his voice kind but measured. "But you need to take it easy. You've been through a lot. Your body needs time to heal." Elijah nodded obediently, though his eyes sparkled with a sense of determination. "I'm going to be okay. I promised myself I'd get better. And I wanted to thank you for saving me." Dr. Martin waved away the gratitude, brushing it off as he always did. "You don't have to thank me, Elijah. I'm just doing my job. You're the one who fought through it. You're strong." But Elijah wasn't done yet. He looked at Dr. Martin intently, his small hands gripping the edge of his hospital blanket. "But I want to thank you in a way that means something," he said, his voice firm despite the fragility of his body. Dr. Martin paused, taken aback by the gravity of the boy's words. There was something about the way Elijah said it, something that struck a chord deep within him. "What do you mean?" Dr. Martin asked, his curiosity piqued. Elijah slowly reached under the covers, pulling something out with effort. It was a small, worn baseball glove, its leather scuffed and frayed at the edges. The glove looked as if it had seen better days, its once smooth surface now rough from years of use. "This was my dad's," Elijah said softly, holding the glove out to Dr. Martin. His voice trembled with emotion as he continued. "He gave it to me before he passed away. He told me it was the one thing he wanted me to have. And now, I want you to have it." Dr. Martin's breath caught in his throat as he looked at the baseball glove. It was more than just a glove. It was a piece of Elijah's history, a link to a father who would never see his son grow up. The weight of the gesture hit Dr. Martin all at once. This wasn't a gift from a patient to a doctor. It was a gift of love, of remembrance, of life. "Elijah, Dr. Martin began, but words failed him. How could he take something so meaningful, something that had so much sentimental value to the boy? "I know it's important," Elijah said, his voice quieter now. "But you saved me. You gave me a chance to make memories with my mom and dad, with my little brother. My dad can't be here, but I still have his glove. I want you to have it, to remember me by." Tanya stepped forward, placing a hand gently on Elijah's shoulder. "We understand, Dr. Martin. It's a huge thing for him to offer you that glove. His father, he always said that baseball was the one thing that brought the two of them together. When Elijah was younger, his father would spend hours teaching him how to catch, how to throw, how to dream." Dr. Martin felt the weight of the words, and in that moment, he understood. Elijah's father, who had passed away years ago, had been more than just a father. He had been a mentor, a guiding figure, and a source of strength for the boy. The glove was the last connection Elijah had to him, and now he was offering it to the man who had saved his life. "I can't take this," Dr. Martin said softly, his voice filled with hesitation. He couldn't. It felt too much, too personal. How could he accept such an extraordinary gift? Elijah looked up at him with a quiet intensity, a maturity that belied his young age. "You can, Dr. Martin. You deserve it. You gave me the chance to live, to be with my family. This glove, it's all I have left of my dad. But now, I want you to have it, to keep it with you, so you can remember what you did for me." Tears welled in Dr. Martin's eyes as he stared at the glove, the symbol of everything Elijah had lost, and everything he had gained. His heart swelled with a mixture of guilt and gratitude. He had done his job. He had saved this boy's life. But there was no way he could truly repay the kindness, the generosity Elijah was showing him. Slowly, reluctantly, Dr. Martin reached out and accepted the glove. It felt heavy in his hands, not because of its size, but because of its meaning. The glove wasn't just a piece of leather and stitching. It was a legacy, a reminder that life, fragile as it was, could change in an instant, but the connections we made, those were the things that lasted. "Thank you, Elijah," Dr. Martin said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'll take care of this. I'll remember you, and I'll never forget what you've given me." The room was silent for a moment, save for the soft beeping of the machines monitoring Elijah's recovery. But in that silence, Dr. Martin realized something he had never fully understood before. It wasn't just about saving lives. It was about the lives we touched and the legacy we left behind. Later that evening, after visiting hours were over, Dr. Martin found himself sitting at his desk in his office, the baseball glove resting on the corner of his desk. The sight of it brought a lump to his throat. Elijah's father had given it to him, and now Elijah had given it to him again, almost as if they were passing on a torch, a symbol of endurance, of strength, and of a life well lived. Dr. Martin reached out and gently picked up the glove, running his fingers over the worn leather. He knew that Elijah would never fully understand the impact his gift had on him. He had thought he had been the one giving, the one saving. But in that moment, he realized that Elijah had given him something far more valuable than he could ever offer, a reminder of what truly mattered. The next day, when Dr. Martin returned to the hospital, he kept the glove in his office, a constant reminder of the boy who had touched his heart in a way no patient ever had before. The bond forged in adversity. Weeks passed, and Elijah's recovery continued to defy the odds. What had once been a fragile, near-fatal condition was now turning into a story of resilience. The young boy, once on the brink of death, was now sitting up in bed without the need for constant medical intervention. His smile had returned, albeit faint at first, but with each passing day, it grew a little stronger. His parents, Tanya and Michael, were once again full of hope, though they continued to stay vigilant, mindful of the long road ahead. They had seen the worst and now clung to the promise of a better future. Dr. Martin visited Elijah daily, checking his progress, making sure his wounds healed properly, and providing words of encouragement. But beyond his professional duties, there was something deeper at play, something he could not quite place. It had started with a baseball glove, a gift so meaningful that it had shaken Dr. Martin to his core. A piece of Elijah's past, a symbol of love and loss, now sat in Dr. Martin's office. Every time he looked at it, he felt a sense of responsibility, not just as a doctor, but as a guardian of this young boy's life. The gesture had been simple, but the weight of it was immense. Elijah's parents, too, began to express their gratitude in ways that surprised Dr. Martin. They weren't just thankful for the life-saving work he had done. They spoke often of the profound effect he had had on their son's spirit. In the weeks following the surgery, Elijah had undergone a transformation that had less to do with the physical healing and more with the emotional fortitude that had emerged in him. He had found a new purpose in life, a desire to fight, not just for himself, but for the people who mattered most. One late afternoon, as Dr. Martin walked into Elijah's room, he was met with a sight that was becoming all too familiar, the boy's beaming smile. "Dr. Martin." Elijah greeted him eagerly, his voice sounding stronger with each day. "I've got something to show you." Dr. Martin smiled in return, though there was a softness to it now, something more than just the usual professional demeanor. It had become evident to him that Elijah was no longer just a patient to him. The boy had become something more, a reminder of why he chose this path in the first place. "What do you have for me today, Elijah?" Dr. Martin asked, his voice filled with warmth. Elijah sat up straighter, his posture proud despite the remaining tubes and bandages. He reached beside his bed and grabbed a small notebook, one filled with crayon drawings and scribbled words. As he flipped through the pages, Dr. Martin noticed the distinctiveness of each illustration: a house with a red roof, a field of flowers, and a picture of two people holding hands, smiling. Then Elijah stopped at one particular page. "This is you," Elijah said, pointing to a drawing of a man in a white coat with a stethoscope around his neck. He was smiling, his arms outstretched toward the boy in front of him. The boy in the drawing, dressed in pajamas, had a huge smile on his face as he stood next to the doctor. Dr. Martin's heart skipped a beat as he looked at the simple drawing, so full of innocence and gratitude. He could feel his chest tighten, and for a moment, he struggled to find words. "You're amazing, Elijah," Dr. Martin said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. This is incredible." The boy beamed, his eyes filled with pride. "You're the reason I'm still here," Elijah said firmly, his young voice carrying the weight of something much older. "I want you to know that. I know it's not much, but this is my way of saying thank you." Dr. Martin was at a loss for words. He had seen gratitude before, thousands of times, but something about this moment, this small boy sitting in front of him, offering his world through crayon and paper, struck him in a way that no other thank you had ever done. It was raw, unfiltered, and genuine. It was a reflection of Elijah's heart, a heart that had been broken and mended, a heart that now beat with the rhythm of resilience. "I'll treasure this forever," Dr. Martin said, taking the notebook gently from Elijah's hands. "I promise you." The days that followed were filled with a quiet sense of accomplishment for Dr. Martin. Elijah's progress continued, but it was more than just his physical recovery that stood out. It was the emotional strength that had grown in him. The boy who had once been on the verge of death now exuded a quiet confidence. His parents marveled at how Elijah had found a new lease on life, a renewed sense of hope that came from a place deeper than anyone could have anticipated. The conversations between Dr. Martin and Elijah had taken on a new depth too. No longer just about the boy's medical condition, their talks ranged from childhood dreams to family stories, from favorite books to future goals. Dr. Martin found himself looking forward to those moments. They became more than doctor-patient encounters. They were shared glimpses into each other's lives, a testament to the unexpected bond that had formed between them. One afternoon, as Dr. Martin sat with Elijah in his room, a nurse entered with some test results. She handed Dr. Martin a chart, and his eyes quickly scanned the numbers. Everything looked stable, but there was still concern regarding Elijah's lung capacity. The road to full recovery wasn't as clear-cut as it had seemed. Dr. Martin put the chart down and turned to Elijah, who was sitting with his legs crossed on the bed, flipping through a magazine. "Elijah," Dr. Martin began, his tone serious but not unkind, "we've got some good news and some challenges ahead. Your lungs are healing, but we'll need to do a little more to make sure they fully recover. This means some additional treatments and rehab, but you've made such great progress that I know you can do it." Elijah nodded, his face turning thoughtful. "I've been thinking a lot about it, he said slowly, looking up from his magazine. "I'm not afraid anymore." Dr. Martin's brow furrowed as he looked at the boy. "Not afraid?" "No," Elijah answered firmly. "Not afraid of the pain, or the doctors, or the treatments. Because now, I know that I'm not alone. You're all here, and I have my family. And even though my dad's not around, I still have him with me, right here," Elijah said, pressing his hand to his chest. "And that makes me brave." Dr. Martin's eyes softened, and he fought to keep his emotions in check. "You're already incredibly brave, Elijah. Your strength is something I've learned a lot from." A silence settled between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was a quiet understanding. an acknowledgement of the shared journey they had been on. For Dr. Martin, this was the part of medicine he had never fully appreciated until now. It wasn't just about saving lives. It was about the lives you touched along the way. And Elijah, this young boy with so much to give, had changed Dr. Martin in ways he never expected. As the days turned into weeks, Dr. Martin found himself eagerly anticipating his daily visits with Elijah. It wasn't just about the clinical checkups anymore. It was about witnessing a transformation, not just in Elijah, but in himself as well. He had been a doctor for many years, saving countless lives. But in those quiet moments with Elijah, he began to realize that the true essence of healing wasn't in the surgeries or the medicines. It was in the bonds formed, the connections made, and the love exchange. And Elijah, with his childlike wisdom and resilience, had shown Dr. Martin that even in the darkest moments, there was always light to be found. One day, as Dr. Martin prepared to leave Elijah's room, the boy called out to him, "Dr. Martin." "Yes, Elijah. I'm going to be okay," Elijah said with a smile that stretched from ear to ear, his eyes sparkling. "And I'm going to make my dad proud. I promise." "I know you will," Dr. Martin replied, his heart full. "I have no doubt." The price of healing. As weeks turned into months, Elijah's recovery became a beacon of hope within the walls of St. Michael's Hospital. His story, one of survival against all odds, was now known by many of the staff. From the nurses who had tended to him in the ICU, to the physical therapists working tirelessly to restore his lung function, everyone had witnessed Elijah's transformation. His will to live was nothing short of extraordinary. But as Elijah's body healed, a different kind of challenge began to emerge, not just for Elijah, but for his family, and even Dr. Martin. Elijah's parents had taken time off work to care for him. While they had once been overwhelmed with worry, they now found themselves struggling with a new set of anxieties. They had learned to live in a constant state of uncertainty during Elijah's fight for survival, but now they faced the complicated task of navigating their new normal. They had been through a storm, and though the sky had cleared, the emotional toll was far from over. One evening, as Dr. Martin made his rounds, he stepped into Elijah's room to find both Tanya and Michael sitting by his bedside. The scene was peaceful, but there was a heaviness in the air, a tension that Dr. Martin could not ignore. Elijah was asleep, his breathing shallow but steady, his face peaceful. The sight of him so calm and safe was a sharp contrast to the boy's battle just a few months ago. "Is everything all right?" Dr. Martin asked, his voice gentle as he approached. Tanya looked up, her face tired but composed. "We're okay, just thinking," she said with a sigh. "I guess we're both still trying to process everything that's happened. You know, it feels like we're on this never-ending roller coaster." Michael nodded, a faraway look in his eyes. "It's hard to move forward. It feels like we should be celebrating Elijah's recovery, but there's this constant weight hanging over us. We don't want to let our guard down. We keep waiting for the other shoe to drop." Dr. Martin nodded in understanding. It's not uncommon for families to feel that way. After everything Elijah's been through, it's only natural to still be anxious, even if things are looking better. Tanya's eyes shimmered with unshed tears as she looked at Dr. Martin. "You've been with us every step of the way. You saved our son's life. But I think we're struggling with something deeper. Elijah's physical recovery is one thing, but what about the emotional scars? The trauma he's experienced? The nightmares?" Dr. Martin's expression softened. He knew that physical healing was only part of the equation. Trauma, especially of the magnitude Elijah had faced, didn't vanish with time. The boy's spirit, his sense of security, needed just as much care as his body. "Elijah is incredibly strong," Dr. Martin said, choosing his words carefully. "But you're right. His emotional recovery will take time, and it's something we need to monitor as much as his physical health. We'll help him through it. Together." Tanya gave a weak smile, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Thank you, Dr. Martin. But sometimes, I think we're all carrying a weight we can't put down. Dr. Martin placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. It's okay to feel that way. Healing is a process. For all of you. As he left the room that night, Dr. Martin found himself reflecting on the conversation. Elijah's survival had been a victory, but it had also exposed a deeper truth. Healing was not just about mending broken bodies. It was about restoring souls too. And Elijah's emotional recovery was something he hadn't fully anticipated, though he now understood just how crucial it was. The unspoken weight. The following days brought both progress and setbacks. Elijah was discharged from the hospital after a prolonged stay, a moment of triumph that had been long awaited. His parents were filled with joy, but there was an underlying nervousness that lingered. Home meant freedom, but it also meant the responsibility of caring for a child who had been through so much. Elijah himself was torn. He was happy to be out of the hospital, but a part of him still felt tied to the sterile walls where he had fought for his life. He still woke up in the middle of the night, gasping for air, his heart pounding, haunted by the memories of the pain he had endured. Sometimes, the once familiar sounds of his home, his parents' voices, the laughter of his younger brother, the hum of the refrigerator, felt foreign to him. It was as though the world had moved on. But he had been left behind, unable to shake the trauma of what he had survived. One evening, as Dr. Martin made a home visit to check on Elijah, he noticed the subtle signs of the boy's unease. Elijah's smile, though still present, lacked the same vibrancy it once had. He was quieter, more withdrawn. His parents did their best to hide their own concerns, but Dr. Martin could see it in their eyes. They were walking a fine line between hope and fear. Elijah, Dr. Martin said as he sat beside the boy, who was lying on the couch, flipping through a book. How have you been feeling? Any trouble with your breathing? Elijah shrugged, his eyes not meeting Dr. Martin's. It's okay. I'm fine. Dr. Martin studied him closely, knowing the boy's tendency to downplay his feelings. Elijah, you don't have to pretend. If something's bothering you, we can talk about it. Elijah paused, and then, with a deep breath, he finally spoke. Sometimes I can't sleep, and when I do, I have dreams. Bad dreams. About the machines. About not being able to breathe. About not being able to wake up. He looked up at Dr. Martin, his eyes wide with fear. What if it happens again? The question hit Dr. Martin like a punch to the gut. What if it happened again? The very thing Dr. Martin had been avoiding in his own mind. The fear that Elijah's progress might not be permanent, that the scars left by the trauma might never fully heal. Dr. Martin sat silently for a moment, considering his response. Elijah, he said softly, I can't promise you that everything will be perfect. No one can. But what I can promise you is this. You're stronger than you know. You've already overcome more than most people will ever face in their lives. And while there might be moments of fear, you don't have to face them alone. Your family's here, and I'm here. You've made it through the hardest part. Elijah nodded slowly, but the doubt in his eyes didn't fade. But I don't feel brave. I feel scared. Dr. Martin's heart ached for the boy. It's okay to feel scared. Everyone feels that way sometimes. But that doesn't mean you're not brave. You've shown courage every single day just by facing this head-on. It's not about never being afraid. It's about moving forward even when you are. The conversation lingered in the air, a mix of silence and unspoken emotions. Elijah's healing was no longer just about his body. It was about finding peace in a mind and heart that had been scarred. And Dr. Martin knew that the journey was far from over. The ripple effects. As Elijah continued his emotional journey, Dr. Martin's role in his life began to evolve. No longer just the doctor who had saved his life, Dr. Martin had become a counselor, a confidant, and a friend. The bond they shared was undeniable, and though the healing process was long and complex, it was clear that Dr. Martin had come to view Elijah as more than just a patient. He had become part of the doctor's life in ways that transcended the professional boundaries that Dr. Martin had once held dear. And Elijah, for his part, had begun to trust Dr. Martin in ways that went beyond the typical relationship between patient and caregiver. He knew that Dr. Martin would always be there, not just as his doctor, but as someone who genuinely cared for him and understood the depth of his struggles. But even as Elijah's emotional scars began to surface, Dr. Martin found himself grappling with his own feelings. The lines between doctor and patient were becoming blurred, and he began to realize just how deeply he had been affected by Elijah's journey. It wasn't just about saving a life. It was about witnessing the resilience of a young boy who, despite all odds, had chosen to live. A glimmer of hope in the dark. As the days passed into weeks, Elijah's family continued to adjust to their new life at home. They had learned to navigate the complexities of their son's recovery, balancing moments of joy with the ever-present fear of setbacks. Tanya and Michael's bond had strengthened as they leaned on one another through this new chapter of their lives. Despite their unease, they remained fiercely protective of their son, determined to help him heal in every way they could. For Elijah, the physical challenges were becoming less daunting. His breathing was steady, and the nightmares had begun to subside, though they had not fully disappeared. He still awoke in the middle of the night, his heart racing, clutching the edge of his bed with trembling hands. Yet each time, he reminded himself of the promise he had made to his parents, that he would be okay. Slowly, those words began to hold meaning. Still, even with the healing of his body, the road to emotional recovery seemed longer. Every small step toward peace was accompanied by a wave of doubt. Could he ever fully leave behind the trauma of his near-death experience? Could he ever feel truly safe again? It was a question that haunted him, one that he often found himself wrestling with in the quiet moments when his mind wandered. The return of hope. It had been nearly 4 months since Elijah's discharge from St. Michael's Hospital, and though his body had healed remarkably, it was clear that he still struggled with the weight of his past. There were days when he seemed like the same bright, energetic boy he had been before the illness, full of laughter, enthusiasm, and curiosity. But on others, Elijah was quieter, more withdrawn, his smile not reaching his eyes. One afternoon, as Dr. Martin sat at his desk reviewing patient charts, his phone buzzed with a familiar name, Michael Bennett, Elijah's father. Dr. Martin had become accustomed to hearing from the Bennetts, and the calls usually brought news of progress or the occasional concern. He picked up the phone, expecting the usual updates on Elijah's recovery. "Dr. Martin, it's Michael," the voice on the other end said, laced with urgency. "I think we need your help. Elijah, he's not doing well. He's having trouble breathing again." A sense of dread settled over Dr. Martin's chest. "Is he at the hospital? I'll be there immediately." No, it's not like before. He's breathing, but it's labored. He's just quiet. He's not himself, and we're worried he's slipping back into that dark place." Dr. Martin felt the weight of those words. Elijah's recovery had been a triumph, a success story within the walls of St. Michael's, but Michael's words reminded him of the fragile nature of healing. Elijah's emotional scars had not yet been fully addressed, and now it seemed like the boy was on the edge of a relapse, one that could undo everything he had worked so hard to overcome. "I'm on my way, Michael," Dr. Martin said firmly. "I'll be there as soon as I can." A moment of vulnerability. When Dr. Martin arrived at the Bennett home, the familiar warmth of the family's house did little to calm his nerves. He was greeted by Tanya, who appeared more frazzled than he had ever seen her. "Elijah's in his room," she said quietly, her eyes filled with worry. "He hasn't been eating, and he's hardly spoken since this morning. We don't know what's going on." "We're all here for you, Elijah," Tanya said, her voice filled with love. "You don't have to carry this alone." For the first time in months, Elijah let himself lean into his parents. He didn't fight the tears that flowed freely down his cheeks. And in that moment, surrounded by love, Dr. Martin knew that Elijah had taken one of the most important steps on his journey to healing. He had let go of the fear that had been holding him back. The path to recovery. The next few weeks brought continued challenges, but also moments of growth. With the support of his family, and with Dr. Martin's continued guidance, Elijah began to open up more about his fears, about the things that haunted him. Each conversation, though difficult, helped to chip away at the barriers Elijah had built around himself. And with each small victory, each step forward, no matter how insignificant it seemed, Elijah began to feel a sense of peace that he hadn't known in months. It wasn't a perfect recovery, and there were days when he still felt overwhelmed, but it was a recovery nonetheless. Dr. Martin continued to visit, not just as a doctor, but as a friend, someone who had been there for Elijah when it mattered most. He knew that healing wasn't linear, and that there would be setbacks along the way. But for the first time, Dr. Martin believed that Elijah could conquer his fear. And that belief was enough. Dr. Martin nodded, following Tanya to Elijah's room. He could hear the faint sound of a boy's voice, but it wasn't the usual cheerful banter he had come to expect. Instead, there was a tone of distress, of sadness. When Dr. Martin entered the room, he found Elijah sitting at the edge of his bed, staring blankly at the floor. His small frame appeared even more fragile than usual. His hands were clenched in his lap, his shoulders hunched in a way that made him seem smaller than he was. "Elijah," Dr. Martin said softly, crouching down to the boy's level. "Hey there, how are you feeling?" Elijah didn't look up. His voice was barely above a whisper when he spoke. "I'm tired, Dr. Martin. Tired of trying to be okay. I don't know how to keep pretending." Dr. Martin's heart ached at the words. Elijah's vulnerability was raw and unfiltered, a reflection of the deep battle he was fighting within himself. The boy had fought so hard to survive, but it seemed that the scars left on his soul were harder to heal than the wounds on his body. "You don't have to pretend, Elijah," Dr. Martin replied gently. "You don't have to be okay all the time. It's okay to not feel okay." Elijah's eyes finally met Dr. Martin's, and there was a raw honesty in them that the doctor had not seen before. "But I don't want to be scared anymore. I want to stop having these bad dreams. I want to stop feeling like I'm always waiting for something bad to happen." Dr. Martin sat beside him on the bed, carefully considering his words. He knew that Elijah wasn't just talking about physical health. He was talking about the burden of fear that had become his constant companion. And as much as Dr. Martin wanted to ease that pain, he knew that healing would take time. It wasn't something that could be fixed with a few comforting words. "You've already shown so much strength, Elijah," Dr. Martin said. "What you're feeling right now doesn't take away from that. Healing doesn't happen all at once. Sometimes it's 2 steps forward, and other times it's 1 step back. But each time you move forward, you're getting stronger. And I'm here, every step of the way." Elijah looked at him, his eyes searching Dr. Martin's face for some sign of reassurance. There was a long silence between them before the boy spoke again, his voice shaky. "I just don't want to be a burden to my family. They've already been through so much." Dr. Martin's heart tightened. He could see now how much Elijah cared for his family, how deeply he internalized their struggles. The weight of that love, of feeling responsible for their pain, was something no child should have to carry. "Elijah," Dr. Martin said firmly, "you are not a burden. Not to your family, and certainly not to me. You've been through something unimaginable, and it's okay to feel the way you do. What matters is that you're still here, and you're still fighting." Tears welled up in Elijah's eyes as he nodded, his chest rising and falling in a series of shallow breaths. It was as though a dam had broken inside him, and the emotions he had been holding in for so long finally began to pour out. "I'm scared, Dr. Martin," he admitted, his voice breaking. "But I don't want to be scared anymore." Dr. Martin reached over and gently placed a hand on Elijah's shoulder. "It's okay to be scared, Elijah. It doesn't mean you're not strong. It just means that you're human. And you have so many people who care about you." Tanya, who had been standing in the doorway, quietly entered the room and sat on the other side of Elijah, taking his hand in hers. Michael, too, appeared in the doorway, his presence silent but strong. Together, The family formed a circle of support around the boy. The triumph of the human spirit. The sun hung low on the horizon as Elijah sat on the back porch of his house, watching the orange glow spill across the sky. It was the kind of evening that made the world seem quieter, softer, a stark contrast to the chaos that had filled his life just a few short months ago. He had come a long way since his time in the hospital. Yet, even now, there were days when the weight of his journey felt almost too much to bear. But tonight was different. Tonight, for the first time in a long while, Elijah felt something he hadn't been able to recognize until now. A sense of peace, a quiet assurance that, though the scars of his past would always be a part of him, they no longer defined who he was. The sound of footsteps on the wooden porch brought Elijah out of his reverie. His mother, Tanya, joined him, settling beside him as the two of them shared the silence. She placed her hand on his, a gesture that had become second nature over the course of their journey together. "How are you feeling, baby?" she asked softly, her eyes filled with a quiet tenderness that could only come from a mother who had watched her child fight for his life. Elijah took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling in the cool evening air. "I'm okay, Mom. I think I'm starting to feel like myself again." A soft smile tugged at Tanya's lips. "I'm so proud of you, Elijah. So proud of how far you've come." Elijah's gaze shifted to the horizon. "It wasn't easy," he murmured, his voice tinged with a mixture of gratitude and sorrow. "But I'm learning to not be afraid of what's next. Embracing the future." The months following Elijah's emotional breakthrough wrought small yet profound changes. His parents, who had once been fearful and uncertain, began to see their son return to the boy they had always known, a boy full of laughter, curiosity, and wonder. Elijah went back to school, though it wasn't without trepidation. He had to adjust to a new normal, one where he could no longer take his health for granted, but he was determined to not let it define him. Dr. Martin continued to check in on Elijah, but now, their interactions were less about medical procedures and more about Elijah's emotional well-being. The relationship between the two had shifted over time from doctor-patient to something more akin to a mentorship. Dr. Martin had become a guiding figure in Elijah's life, someone who had helped him navigate the darkest days of his recovery. Elijah had grown close to Dr. Martin's own children, especially his daughter Emily, who was just a year older than him. Emily had always been a source of comfort for Elijah, someone who understood his struggle and who never treated him as fragile. With her, he could simply be himself, no expectations, no pressure, just two kids who enjoyed the same things, like video games, basketball, and late-night conversations about their dreams for the future. Through it all, Elijah's family remained the cornerstone of his healing. His parents, who had been so overwhelmed by his illness, had found new purpose in caring for him. Their bond, though once strained by the stress of uncertainty, had been made stronger by their shared experience. They had been through hell together, but they had also found a way back to each other. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about Elijah's journey was not just his recovery, but the way it inspired those around him. A family reborn. On a bright Saturday morning, with the sun shining and the promise of a warm day ahead, Elijah's family gathered in the backyard for a simple barbecue. It wasn't a celebration of his recovery, not in the traditional sense, but a quiet acknowledgement that life had returned to normal, that they had made it through the storm. Dr. Martin had been invited, of course, as he had become not just a healer, but a dear friend to the family. As the food sizzled on the grill and laughter echoed across the yard, Elijah found himself sitting at the picnic table, his heart swelling with gratitude for the people who had been with him through every step of this journey. "Hey, Elijah," Dr. Martin said, approaching him with a wide grin. "How's the basketball game going?" Elijah chuckled, though there was a hint of embarrassment in his voice. "I'm still getting my game back, Dr. Martin. But, I think I'm doing okay. I can actually make a shot now without collapsing." Dr. Martin laughed, shaking his head. "Well, it's progress. I'll give you that." Tanya, who had overheard their conversation, came over and placed a hand on Elijah's shoulder. "You're doing more than okay, sweetie. You're doing amazing." Elijah's smile faltered for just a moment, and his gaze drifted toward his parents. His mother's hand rested on his father's arm, a silent bond of love and support. Elijah realized in that moment how much his family had sacrificed, not just for him, but for one another. Their love had been the foundation of his recovery, and without it, he wouldn't have made it this far. "I'm not sure I would have made it without you guys," Elijah said quietly, his voice carrying an emotion he hadn't fully understood until now. His father, Michael, put a hand on his son's back and leaned in to kiss the top of his head. "You didn't have to do it alone, son. You never did." The day passed in a haze of smiles and laughter. The family, united by their shared experiences and by the strength of their love, basked in the warmth of the sun and the peace that had returned to their lives. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated joy, one that Elijah would carry with him forever. The power of giving back. As time went on, Elijah continued to thrive. The boy who had once been frail, broken, and afraid had become a young man full of ambition, dreams, and possibilities. He had resumed his studies, taking a particular interest in science, hoping to one day follow in Dr. Martin's footsteps and become a doctor himself. But more than that, Elijah had discovered a passion for helping others, especially those who had faced the same challenges he had. It wasn't long before Elijah began volunteering at St. Michael's Hospital, his once feared place of healing now a symbol of hope for him. He worked with the staff, helping to brighten the days of young patients who were fighting their own battles. He shared his story, offering hope to families who felt the same despair he once had. It wasn't just about giving back. It was about showing others that recovery, in all its forms, was possible. The boy who had been saved was now saving others, in his own way. The final testimony. A few years later, as Elijah stood on the stage at a hospital gala, one that raised funds for pediatric care, he found himself giving a speech to a crowd of people who had followed his journey from the very beginning. His voice wavered only slightly as he spoke, and his words held the power of someone who had not only overcome adversity, but had come to embrace it as part of his story. "When I was sick, I couldn't see the end," he said, his voice steady now. "I couldn't see past the pain, the fear, and the doubt. But now I know that life doesn't always give us what we want, but it always gives us what we need. I've been given a second chance, not just at life, but at being the person I've always wanted to be, a person who can help others, a person who can make a difference." He paused, his eyes scanning the room, and found his parents sitting in the front row, beaming with pride. And in the very back of the room, he saw Dr. Martin, his mentor, his friend, and the man who had been there when Elijah had needed him most. Elijah smiled, his heart full of gratitude. "Thank you for believing in me when I couldn't believe in myself. This is just the beginning." In the final chapter of Elijah's journey, he stands as a testament to the human spirit, resilient, strong, and capable of healing in ways that transcend even the most difficult circumstances. His story is one of transformation, not just of body but of soul. Through the love of his family, the guidance of those who cared for him, and his own unwavering determination, Elijah found his way back from the brink of despair. He is a beacon of hope for others, a living proof that no matter how dark the road may seem, there is always light at the end.